And I suspect that Manasseh's theological policies, given his long and successful reign, I mean, how many of these guys get assassinated, is much more of an indicator of their being representative of the population and the nations around him. His success probably proved him right, despite what the Yahwist partisans would have liked to have believed in their backbiting bickering about him. And after his long reign, his son Ammon would be assassinated, perhaps by Yahwist partisans, and his 8-year-old son Josiah, who was now at this point 8 years old and could be manipulated, and it would be that very Josiah that would lead another Yahwist reform or inquisition, again, depending on where you sit on this whole issue, further destroying non-Yahweh shrines and non-Jerusalem Yahweh shrines, just to the degree to which of, again, isn't quite clear. I mean, his contemporary is Jeremiah, who doesn't really even seem to mention these kinds of things, and that would have been the kind of thing Jeremiah would have been all about. And Josiah is also not attested anywhere else outside the Bible. However, the biblical text tells us that he did oversee renovations of God's house, the temple, and during that work, a scroll of the law was discovered and eventually vetted by the Israelite prophetess Huldah. Now, many scholars, including myself, are rightly skeptical of this account. You just happen to find a scroll on a wall, considering that if this is probably much more likely that later Yahwists actually produced a document very much like the book of Deuteronomy, or perhaps its core, chapters 12 through 26, with the northern prophetess Huldah vetting the text, acting as a kind of unifying force between the northern refugees and southern religious life, thus making Josiah, at least symbolically, a king of a reunified Yahwist monarchy, or a unified Yahwist monarchy, assuming there ever really wasn't one to begin with. Further, the theology of this document is subtly subversive of the existing order of the day. By Josiah's rule, the Assyrian Empire was collapsing. The Neo-Babylonian Empire was not yet fully on its feet, but it was coming, and Egypt was not yet able to establish regional hegemony given its former conquest by the Assyrians. Thus, the Judean highlands were able to operate with a high degree of de facto autonomy. This political autonomy was probably theologically enshrined in that Deuteronomic code written or discovered in the wall by those folks. That theology takes the form of a vassal contract, something the Judeans knew a lot about at this point, in which Judea became a vassal of Yahweh, following the laws laid down by that code in return for protection. It's always a protection racket, this Yahweh stuff. Land, agricultural success, and a large number of descendants. This is a fascinating document because it represents a kind of theological anarchism, a long tradition, frankly, in Israelite literature, in which the Israelites, or Judeans with this case, would only ultimately answer to Yahweh and not some other earthly power. However, the priesthood and the king would act as intermediaries in this vassal contract. But what if that king and that priesthood, with its temple, were destroyed by, say, a rampaging Neo-Babylonian army? What happens if the vassal contract now is simply between Israel and Yahweh? But a bit more about that priesthood and their contributions to this discussion. Among their ranks were the day-to-day servants and shock troops of the Yahweh partisans. Of course, they served at the behest of the kings, and so the degree of their monolatry wasn't entirely up to them, as attested by various prophetic condemnations. Of course, many priests were almost surely also only lukewarm Yahwists, and I'm sure many of them happily served in the henotheistic environment of at least the Yahweh-Asherah couple in the temple. However, it appears that at least some priests began to develop a highly sophisticated theory of something like sacred contagion, where strict control of the spread of what was ritually fit from what was not must be very carefully maintained. This was accomplished by maintaining and managing states of ritual fitness and fulfilling a sacrificial cycle by which Yahweh was nourished, physically nourished in some sense, but also by which contamination could be curtailed and repaired, all of which was meant to maintain a state of cosmic homeostasis. In fact, when they envisioned the creation of the world, they relied upon very common ancient Near East tropes in which the divine wrests the world from watery chaos, but rather than personalize those forces of chaos, these priests seem to have demythologized them with the divine world, seems to have demythologized those elements with the divine creating the world, not from nothing, that's a much, much later idea, but by separating out various cosmic forces and entities from one another, culminating in the ultimate separation of time itself into the week and the Sabbath. This separation creation structure would then be mirrored in the creation of the tabernacle or the Mishkan, and in turn in the Jerusalem temple, especially as it's spelled out in Exodus 35 through 40, the dwelling of the Israelite divine upon the earth. Now again, this isn't monotheism. The remains of the divine council can still be heard in the creation separation process, along with there being chaos monsters inhabiting primordial uncreated waters, meaning that this deity is by no means alone in this creation separation process. But what we do see here is yet another tendency during this period of some degree of demythologizing, where primeval chaos is no longer personified as in the chaos comp, typically in the form of a snake or a serpent, and where a divine council of we is acting in a singular fashion, with that creator separator eventually coming to have a singular dwelling place upon the earth. Though you can still see lots of examples of God having to fight sea monsters in the Hebrew Bible. You can see it in Job, and you can see it in Psalm 74. But again, all in all, the interests of the priestly obsession with creating and maintaining a harmonious balance of the sacred and the profane through the very careful management of the temple sacrificial system does reveal yet another aspect of this on-ramping toward monotheism in the form of a demythologizing system of describing how the world was created through separation. Again, not created from nothing. That is a much, much later, probably 600 years later, theological and philosophical innovation of really the Greek world and not the Israelite world. But to return to Yahweh, Yahweh's fate was not going to be sealed by not only men, but by non-Israelites.